The rifle crack echoed across the ridge, and somewhere in the jungle below, a man fell without a sound. Then another, then three more in the span of 8 seconds. The Japanese platoon scrambling up the slope didn't know where the shots were coming from. They didn't know how many Americans were still up there. All they knew was that men kept dying, and the ridge they had been ordered to take was turning into a graveyard. It was January 14th, 1945, and the battle for Luzon in the Philippines had become a grinding, brutal campaign of attrition. The American forces had landed at Lingayen Gulf 2 weeks earlier, pushing inland against fierce Japanese resistance. Every hill, every village, every rice paddy was contested. The enemy had no intention of giving up the islands without bleeding the invaders white, and they had prepared defensive positions across the entire length of the Central Valley. One of those positions was a nameless ridge overlooking a narrow jungle trail that served as a critical supply route for advancing American units. Control of that ridge meant control of the valley below. Lose it, and the enemy could interdict convoys, ambush patrols, and slow the entire offensive to a crawl. The ridge had been held by a reinforced platoon from the 25th Infantry Division for 3 days when the order came to pull back. Intelligence reported a full Japanese battalion moving into the area, preparing for a coordinated assault. The platoon was undermanned, low on ammunition, and exhausted. Staying would mean annihilation, so the lieutenant gave the order: pack up, fall back to the secondary line, regroup, and hold there. Most of the men obeyed immediately, grateful for the chance to escape before the enemy arrived in force. But one man didn't move. Private Harold Moore sat in his foxhole, checked the ammunition pouches on his belt, and kept his eyes on the trail below. Harold Moore was 23 years old, a farm boy from rural Kansas who had grown up hunting deer and coyotes across the open plains. He had enlisted in 1943, trained as a rifleman, and been shipped to the Pacific with a reputation as one of the best shots in his company. He didn't talk much. He didn't make friends easily. But when it came time to qualify on the rifle range, he had scored expert with every weapon he touched. The M1 Garand rifle he carried was a piece of precision machinery, semi-automatic, gas-operated, capable of firing 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. In Harold's hands, it was something more. It was an extension of his will, a tool he understood instinctively, the way a painter understands a brush or a pianist understands keys. He had been raised to respect firearms, to clean them meticulously, to treat them as instruments that demanded discipline and care. And he had been taught, from the age of 10, that every shot mattered. Ammunition cost money. Wasted shots meant wasted effort. If you pulled the trigger, something should fall. That philosophy had served him well on the farm, and it served him even better in combat. When the order to retreat came through, Harold heard it clearly. He understood the logic. He knew the risks. But he also knew what would happen if the ridge was abandoned without a fight. The Japanese would move up, occupy the high ground, and use it to ambush every American patrol and supply convoy that passed through the valley. Men would die because no one had slowed the enemy down, because no one had made them pay for taking that ground. Harold had lost friends in ambushes like that. He had carried their bodies back to the aid station, watched medics shake their heads and pull blankets over faces that would never see home again. He wasn't going to let it happen again if he could stop it. So when a squad leader called his name and waved for him to fall back, Harold shook his head. The sergeant stared at him, confused. "Moore, let's go." "That's an order." Harold looked back once, met his eyes, and said quietly, "I'll catch up." The sergeant hesitated. He didn't have time to argue. The column was already moving, and staying to force the issue would put everyone at risk. So he cursed under his breath, turned, and followed the others down the trail. Harold listened to the sound of boots fading into the jungle, and then there was silence. He wasn't alone for long. Within 30 minutes, the first Japanese scouts appeared at the edge of the clearing below. They moved cautiously, rifles raised, eyes scanning the abandoned American positions. Harold let them come. He was dug in behind a natural berm of earth and stone, his rifle resting on a flat rock, his body concealed by a tangle of vines and undergrowth. The enemy soldiers advanced slowly, checking foxholes, looking for signs of booby traps or rear guard ambushes. Harold counted 12 men in the first group. He waited until they were halfway across the clearing, spread out in a loose skirmish line, focused on the foxholes rather than the tree line behind them. Then he fired. The first shot dropped the lead scout, a clean hit to the chest that spun him around and sent him crashing into the dirt. Harold worked the trigger, the M1 Garand's semi-automatic action chambering the next round instantly, and fired again. The second man fell, then the third. By the time the Japanese soldiers realized they were under fire, 4 of them were dead, and the rest were scrambling for cover. Harold shifted his aim, tracking movement, leading targets the way he had learned to lead running deer across open fields. He fired methodically, 1 shot per target, no wasted rounds. When the 8th cartridge ejected with the distinctive metallic ping of an empty end-block clip, he dropped below the berm, reloaded in 3 seconds, and came back up firing. The Japanese soldiers didn't know how many shooters they were facing. The volume of fire suggested at least a squad, maybe more. They called for reinforcements and hunkered down, returning fire blindly toward the ridge. Bullets snapped to the trees above Harold's position, clipping branches, thudding into tree trunks. But he had chosen his position well. The berm provided solid cover, and the undergrowth concealed his muzzle flash. He wasn't shooting back at random. He was waiting, watching, picking his shots. When an enemy soldier shifted position, Harold saw the movement and fired. When someone raised their head to look for targets, Harold put a round through it. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He was simply doing what he had been trained to do, what he had done 1,000 times on the farm, reducing the problem to its fundamentals. See the target, estimate the range, account for wind and elevation, breathe, squeeze, follow through. It was a rhythm, a process, and as long as he followed it, the shots went where he wanted them to go. By mid-morning, the Japanese had pulled back to regroup. Harold used a lull to check his ammunition and assess the situation. He had started with 120 rounds, distributed across 15 8-round clips. He had fired 43 rounds so far and counted 11 confirmed kills, possibly more among the wounded who had been dragged back into the jungle. His ammunition situation was manageable, but not sustainable. If the enemy came again in force, he would run out of bullets long before he ran out of targets. He needed to be more selective, more efficient. He also needed to move. Staying in the same position for too long would allow the enemy to pinpoint his location and bring mortars or grenades to bear. So he gathered his gear, low-crawled 30 yards to the west, and set up in a new position overlooking a different section of the trail. From here, he had a clear view of the approach route the Japanese would most likely use for their next assault. And when they came, he would be ready. The second attack began just after noon. This time, the Japanese committed a full company, more than 80 men advancing in 3 separate columns, attempting to envelop the ridge from multiple directions simultaneously. It was a sound tactic designed to overwhelm a small defensive force by splitting their fire and creating gaps in the line. But there was no line. There was only Harold Moore, and he couldn't be in 3 places at once. So he made a choice. He ignored the flanking columns and focused on the center group, the one advancing up the main trail. If he could break their momentum, cause confusion and casualties, the other 2 groups might hesitate, lose coordination, and give him more time. He waited until the enemy soldiers were within 100 yards, close enough that he could see faces, read body language, identify who was giving orders and who was following them. Then he targeted the leaders first. The officer leading the column went down with the first shot. The sergeant behind him fell with the second. Leaderless, the men hesitated. And in that moment of confusion, Harold poured fire into the massive bodies. He emptied 1 clip, reloaded, emptied another. Men fell, screamed, scattered. The advance stalled. The flanking columns heard the gunfire and assumed the center group had made contact with the main American force. They slowed their advance, waiting for coordination, trying to figure out what was happening. Harold gave them no time to think. He shifted his position again, moving quickly through the undergrowth, circling around to a spot where he could see the eastern flank. They were bunched up, moving through a narrow defile between 2 rocky outcroppings, perfect terrain for an ambush. Harold dropped prone behind a fallen log, steadied his rifle, and opened fire. The range was longer here, nearly 200 yards, but the targets were stationary and exposed. He fired carefully, aiming for center mass, letting the rifle do its work. The first 3 shots dropped 3 men. The rest dove for cover, returning fire wildly in his general direction. Harold rolled to his left, moved 10 yards, came up in a new spot, and fired again. He was using the terrain, using movement, making himself impossible to pin down. The Japanese soldiers couldn't get a fix on him. Every time they thought they had located the shooter, he was somewhere else, firing from a different angle. It was maddening, demoralizing, and devastatingly effective. By mid-afternoon, the Japanese assault had collapsed. They had lost more than 30 men, with dozens more wounded, and they had gained no ground. The officers commanding the attack couldn't understand what had gone wrong. Their intelligence had indicated the ridge was lightly defended, possibly abandoned. Instead, they had run into what seemed like a well-coordinated defensive position with overlapping fields of fire and expertly placed shooters. They called off the attack and requested artillery support to soften up the position before trying again. But the artillery never came. The guns were needed elsewhere, supporting other operations, and the ridge was deemed a secondary objective. The Japanese commander was told to hold position, observe, and wait for further orders, which meant Harold had bought time. Not much, but enough. As the sun began to set, Harold took stock of his situation. He was alone on a ridge surrounded by enemy forces. He had no radio, no way to call for help or coordinate with friendly units. His ammunition was running low, down to fewer than 50 rounds. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and hungry, but he was still alive, and the ridge was still contested. The enemy hadn't taken it. They hadn't moved up their forces. And somewhere down in the valley, American convoys were still moving supplies forward, unaware that a single rifleman had kept a critical choke point out of Japanese hands for an entire day. Harold allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, then pushed it aside. The fight wasn't over. The enemy would come again, probably at dawn, and this time they would be more careful, more coordinated, more determined. He needed to prepare. He needed to move again, find a better position, create as many problems for them as possible before they finally overran him, because that's what would happen eventually. He knew it. He accepted it, but he was going to make them pay for every foot of ground. The night was long and cold. Harold didn't sleep. He moved through the darkness, setting up multiple firing positions, stacking loose ammunition clips at each one, preparing field to fire. He was creating the illusion of a larger force, multiple shooters spread across the ridge, each with pre-designated sectors and overlapping coverage. It was a trick he had read about in training manuals, a way for a small force to appear larger and more organized than it actually was. He didn't know if it would work, but it was better than sitting in one hole and waiting to be surrounded. As he worked, he thought about the men he had killed that day. He didn't feel guilt exactly, but he felt the weight of it. Each shot had ended a life, stopped a heart, erased a future. Those men had families, homes, people who loved them, but they had also been trying to kill him, trying to take ground that would be used to kill his friends. War reduced everything to that simple calculus. You or them, survival or death. There was no room for hesitation, no space for doubt. You did what needed to be done, and you lived with it afterward. Dawn came slowly, the sky turning from black to gray to pale orange. Harold was back in his primary position, the one with the best view of the main trail, when the Japanese attacked again. This time, they came with everything. A full battalion, more than 400 men, advancing on the ridge from every direction at once. They had mortars, machine guns, grenade launchers. They had learned from the previous day's failures and were taking no chances. Harold watched them come, counted the numbers, and felt a cold knot of certainty settle in his stomach. This was it. This was the end. He couldn't stop 400 men. He couldn't even slow them down for long. But he could make them remember him. He opened fire. The M1 Garand barked rhythmically. Each shot deliberate, each target chosen. Harold worked through his first clip, dropped it, reloaded, fired again. He was shooting faster now, not because he was panicking, but because there were so many targets that precision mattered less than volume. He emptied a second clip, a third, a fourth. Men fell. The advance slowed but didn't stop. Mortar rounds began landing on the ridge, walking across the hillside, searching for him. Harold moved, sprinting from one position to the next, firing from each one, creating the illusion that there were multiple shooters. It worked for a while. The enemy's soldiers hesitated, confused, trying to coordinate their fire, but the sheer weight of numbers was overwhelming. They kept coming, kept pushing, kept closing the distance. Harold was down to his last 2 clips when he heard the sound he had been waiting for. Gunfire. Not Japanese. American. The sharp crack of M1 rifles. The heavier chatter of Browning machine guns. The deep thump of mortars. His unit had come back. They had heard the fighting, realized he was still on the ridge, and turned around. They hit the Japanese assault from the flank, pouring fire into the packed columns, breaking the attack. The enemy's soldiers, already disoriented by Harold's defense, couldn't handle a 2-front fight. They broke and ran, retreating back down the hillside in disorder. The ridge held. When the firing finally stopped, Harold's squad leader found him sitting in his foxhole, rifle across his lap, hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The sergeant stared at him, at the empty ammunition clips scattered around position, at the bodies visible down the slope. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he asked, "How many?" Harold shrugged. "I don't know. Didn't count." But others did count. Over the next 2 days, as the area was secured and the dead were catalogued, the body count kept rising. 64 confirmed enemy kills, all attributed to rifle fire from the ridge, all inflicted by a single shooter over a 24-hour period. It was a ratio of effectiveness that defied standard infantry doctrine. One man, with 1 rifle and 120 rounds of ammunition, had held a critical position against an enemy battalion, delayed their advance, and enabled his unit to counterattack successfully. It should not have been possible. But Harold Moore had made it possible through skill, discipline, and an absolute refusal to abandon his post. The story spread quickly through the division. Harold Moore became a legend overnight, the farm boy from Kansas who had single-handedly stopped a Japanese battalion. Reporters wanted to interview him. Officers wanted to study his tactics. His fellow soldiers wanted to know how he had done it. What secret he possessed that allowed him to shoot with such devastating accuracy under such extreme pressure. Harold didn't have a good answer for them. He just said he had done what needed to be done, the same thing any of them would have done in his position. But that wasn't true, and everyone knew it. Most men, faced with overwhelming odds and no hope of reinforcement, would have retreated. They would have followed orders, fallen back, and lived to fight another day. Harold had stayed, and that choice, that single decision to hold his ground when every rational instinct told him to run, had changed the course of the battle. The Japanese forces in the area learned about the ridge within hours of the failed assault. Reports filtered back to higher command describing unexpectedly fierce resistance, heavy casualties, and a defensive position that seemed impossible to crack. The local commander, a colonel named Matsuda Kenjiro, requested a full briefing on what had gone wrong. When he learned that the entire attack had been stopped by a single American rifleman, he didn't believe it. He demanded verification, interrogation of prisoners, confirmation from multiple sources. Every source told the same story. 1 man, 1 rifle, 64 dead. Matsuda sat in silence for a long time after hearing the report. Then he issued new orders. Avoid that sector. Find another route. Do not engage American positions on high ground without overwhelming force and artillery support. The psychological impact of Harold's stand extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. It planted doubt, created caution, and made the enemy think twice before pressing attacks that might encounter similar resistance. Back in the American lines, Harold Moore was offered promotion, a medal, and a transfer to a safer posting. He declined all 3. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want to be treated differently. He just wanted to stay with his unit and do his job. The Medal of Honor recommendation was submitted anyway, but it was downgraded to a silver star somewhere in the bureaucratic chain of command. The official reasoning was that while Harold's actions were undoubtedly heroic, they did not meet the specific criteria for the nation's highest military decoration. The unofficial reasoning was that his story was too extraordinary, too unbelievable, and awarding the Medal of Honor to a man who had supposedly killed 64 enemy soldiers single-handedly would invite skepticism and accusations of propaganda. So he received the Silver Star instead, a medal he accepted with quiet grace, and then put in a drawer and never looked at again. Harold Moore survived the war. He fought through the rest of the Philippines campaign, participated in the occupation of Japan, and returned home to Kansas in late 1946. He went back to farming, married a local schoolteacher, raised 3 children, and lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He never talked about the war. When people asked, he would say it was just something that had to be done, and then he would change the subject. His children grew up not knowing that their father was a decorated combat veteran. His grandchildren learned about it only after his death in 1998, when they found a box of old military records in the attic. Among those records was a faded after-action report describing the defense of an unnamed ridge in Luzon, and a handwritten note from his squad leader that said simply, "Moore saved us all. He stayed when everyone else ran." I will never forget that. The ridge where Harold Moore made his stand was never officially named. It appears on military maps as Hill 352, a designation that conveys nothing about what happened there, nothing about the man who held it against impossible odds. But the veterans who served with him knew. They called it Moore's Ridge, and they told the story to their children and grandchildren, passing it down through generations as a reminder of what one person can accomplish when they refuse to give up, when they trust their training, and when they understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand your ground and fight. The story of Harold Moore is not widely known outside of military history circles. He never wrote a memoir. No film was ever made about his actions. He exists in the historical record as a footnote, a single line in a division history, noting that Private Harold Moore was awarded the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism during the Luzon campaign. But to the men who were there, to the soldiers whose lives were saved because he refused to retreat, he was something more. He was proof that individual courage matters, that one person in the right place at the right time can change outcomes, and that the difference between victory and defeat often comes down to someone willing to do the hard thing when everyone else has already given up. The lessons of Moore's Ridge extend beyond the battlefield. They speak to a broader truth about human capability and the power of individual action. We live in a world that emphasizes teamwork, coordination, and collective effort, and those things are important. But we also need to remember that change often begins with a single person who sees a problem and decides to do something about it, even when the odds are overwhelmingly against them, even when no one else is watching, even when failure seems inevitable. Harold Moore was that person. He saw a ridge that needed to be held, a mission that needed to be completed, and he stayed when everyone else left. He didn't do it for glory. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because it was the right thing to do, because he had the skills to make a difference, and because he couldn't live with himself if he walked away. That kind of moral clarity, that willingness to act on principle even at great personal risk, is rare, but it is not impossible. It exists in all of us, waiting to be called upon, waiting for the moment when we are tested and must decide who we really are. The M1 Garand rifle that Harold Moore carried during his stand on the ridge was a standard issue weapon, identical to millions of others produced during World War II. There was nothing special about it mechanically, no custom modifications or unique features. But in Harold's hands, it became an instrument of precision and lethality that exceeded every design specification and training manual projection. That is the essential truth of tools, whether they are rifles or computers or ideas. Their effectiveness depends entirely on the skill, discipline, and intent of the person wielding them. The rifle didn't kill 64 enemy soldiers. Harold Moore did. The rifle was just a means by which his will was expressed. His training was applied, and his courage was made manifest. After the war, the rifle was turned in, refurbished, and likely issued to another soldier in another conflict. It exists somewhere, if it still exists at all, anonymous and unmarked, indistinguishable from countless others. But for 24 hours on a jungle ridge in the Philippines, it was the most important weapon in the Pacific theater, and the man who carried it was the most important soldier on that battlefield. Harold Moore's story raises uncomfortable questions about how we remember war and who we choose to honor. The great generals of famous battles, the turning points that change the course of history. All of these receive attention, commemoration, and study. But what about the small actions, the individual stands, the moments of quiet heroism that happened in obscurity and were never recorded in official histories? How many hero Moors were there in World War II, in Vietnam, in Iraq and Afghanistan? Men and women who did extraordinary things that no one witnessed, no one documented, no one remembered. The answer is unknowable, but the number is certainly large. War is full of these hidden stories, acts of courage and sacrifice that slip through the cracks of historical record and vanish into the past. We owe it to those people, and to ourselves, to seek out those stories when we can, to honor them, and to learn from them. Because the lessons they teach are not about tactics or strategy or grand campaigns. They are about character, about what it means to stand firm when everything around you is collapsing, about the capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. In the years after World War II, military theorists studied the defense of Moores Ridge, trying to understand the tactical principles that made it successful. They analyzed fields of fire, use of terrain, ammunition conservation, and psychological warfare. They created training scenarios based on engagement, teaching soldiers how to use superior marksmanship and positioning to offset numerical disadvantage. But the one thing they couldn't teach, the one element that couldn't be reduced to doctrine or drilled into recruits, was a decision Harold Moore made to stay. That decision was personal, rooted in values and character that existed before he ever put on a uniform. It came from his upbringing on a Kansas farm, where hard work and responsibility were not abstract concepts but daily realities. It came from his father, who taught him that a job worth starting was a job worth finishing, no matter how difficult it became. It came from his own sense of duty, his understanding that some things are worth fighting for even when the cost is steep and the outcome uncertain. You cannot teach that in boot camp. You cannot instill it with training exercises or motivational speeches. It is something that exists within a person or does not, and all the military can do is create situations where it can be expressed. The Japanese soldiers who fought at Moores Ridge and survived the war rarely spoke about the experience. In post-war Japan, defeat was a source of shame, and veterans often chose silence over reliving painful memories. But in a few documented cases, former soldiers mentioned an engagement in the Philippines where they faced a single American shooter who seemed invincible, who could not be pinned down or killed, who turned routine assault into a bloodbath. One veteran, interviewed in the 1980s for an oral history project, described the experience as encountering a demon, a supernatural force that defied explanation. We kept advancing, and he kept shooting, and men kept falling. We couldn't see him. We couldn't stop him. It was like fighting a ghost. When the interviewer asked if he thought it was really just one man, the veteran paused for a long time before answering. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. But it felt like one man. One man who decided we would not pass. That perception, that feeling of facing an implacable enemy who would not yield, was as important as the actual casualties inflicted. It created fear, hesitation, and doubt that affected Japanese tactical decisions for weeks afterward. Harold Moore never considered himself a hero. In the few interviews he granted later in life, he consistently downplayed his actions, attributing his survival to luck and his success to training. Anyone could have done it, he said. I just happened to be there. But that assessment misses the point. Yes, any well-trained rifleman with adequate ammunition and good cover could theoretically hold a position against superior numbers for a limited time. But most wouldn't. Most would assess the odds, recognize the futility, and make the rational decision to retreat. Harold's heroism was not in his marksmanship, impressive though it was. It was in his willingness to ignore rationality, to reject a sensible choice, and to stand his ground because standing was what the mission required. That is a different kind of courage, rarer and more difficult than physical bravery in the face of enemy fire. It is moral courage, the courage to make a hard choice knowing you will not be rewarded for it, knowing you may not survive it, but making it anyway because it aligns with your values and your understanding of duty. The American military learned important lessons from engagements like Moores Ridge, lessons that shaped infantry doctrine for decades. The importance of marksmanship training, the value of defensive positions, the psychological impact of accurate fire, All of these concepts were reinforced and emphasized in post-war training programs. But the most important lesson was one that could not be codified or written into field manuals. It was a recognition that individual initiative, the willingness of a single soldier to make independent decisions and act on them without waiting for orders, could be the difference between mission success and failure. Modern military forces emphasize this principle through concepts like mission command and decentralized decision-making. They train soldiers to think for themselves, to assess situations and respond appropriately even when communications are down and commanders are absent. Harold Moore embodied that principle long before it had a name, long before it was taught systematically. He saw what needed to be done, made his own decision, and executed it with skill and determination. That is the kind of soldier every military wants, but few actually cultivate, because cultivating that mindset requires trusting subordinates to make life-and-death decisions without supervision, and institutions are inherently uncomfortable with that level of autonomy. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit subscribe. Let's keep honoring the courage of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below.